In this video, we'll look how the war transformed the economies of both the United States and the Confederate States. Of course, I just thought I want to reiterate what a horrible and big war it was. The percentage of Americans killed relative to the population, which I've referenced in previous videos, was the worst in history. And as you've already know, the fighting destroyed much of the economic infrastructure in the South. And of course, there's nothing more expensive a government can do than wage war, and this war just cost a tremendous amount of money. To give you an example of that, daily spending by the United States federal government grew from about $172,000 to $1.5 million. Because obviously the war cost so much, both sides are going to try three different strategies. They're going to have greater and more diverse borrowing, newer and greater taxes, and they're going to expand the amount of money they have in the system. But because the sizes of their economy were so much different, the degree to which the North and South relied on these three methods differed as well. Guiding the United States economy was U.S. Secretary of Treasury Samuel P. Chase, who was shown here. And one of the first things that Chase did was appoint the Philadelphia banker Jay Cook, shown here, to coordinate a program of selling U.S. bonds directly to individuals. Before, the United States had only borrowed from banks and financial institutions. Now Chase and Cook decided that the U.S. should bypass the banks and issue government bonds directly to the people. And the U.S. would pay the people back directly with interest. These bonds had odd names depending on the interest rate charged or the period of repayment. For example, the 730 shown here had an interest rate of 7.3%. Chase also made an effort to sell the bonds by devising installment plans, loaning the government money a little bit at the time. As a result of this, more people had an idea of bonds and stocks. Americans were just becoming more knowledgeable. By the end of the war, the U.S. government had sold 5% of its population bonds, promising, of course, to pay these bonds back with interest. In the end, the North had enough wealth and a strong enough economy that 2/3 of the cost of the war was going into debt by selling directly to people bonds. Of course, the U.S. debt rose dramatically. Before the war, the national debt amounted to less than $1 per person. But after the war, it stood at $75 per person. And of course, the size of the U.S. government obviously rose too. In 1865, the last year of the war, the U.S. spent a total of $1.297 billion. This was the first time in history that any nation had an annual billion-dollar budget. The second thing that Chase did was raise taxes. He raised taxes on almost everything. Legal documents, ferries, toll companies, canal companies, and a great variety of sales taxes. The tax on liquor reached an astounding $2.50 per gallon. Untaxed, the price was only 20 cents per gallon. Among the many taxes that Chase instituted was the first income tax in U.S. history. That's when we tax the income of the people directly. I should note that it was a type of tax we would later call a progressive income tax. The tax to be paid the rate to be paid, I should say, rose with the income level. In other words, it wasn't a flat tax. It ranged from 3% on all income over $800 to 10% for all income over $10,000. Here you can see a receipt for an income tax payment. All total, the government raised 21% of this total cost of the war through higher taxes. And I'm including in that figure, by the way, higher tariffs as well. The third thing that Chase did was increase the money supply, increase the amount of money in the economy. Prior to the Civil War, the government emitted specie coins, that's gold and silver, precious metals, but it hadn't issued paper money. Rather, private banks would issue banknotes based upon the specie under their control, and then these notes were exchanged as paper money. Holders of the notes could, therefore, theoretically take them to the bank and exchange them for the stated value in specie anytime they wanted. Shown here is a private banknote. Because the U.S. held gold reserves as well as other valuable metals it coined, such as silver, the specie, the government could indirectly control the money supply by coining more specie coins. The banks would then feel confident to issue more private banknotes, and the result would stimulate the economy. If the government felt that the banks were issuing too many banknotes and inflation was becoming a problem, the government could curtail the minting of the specie coins. The banks would then get nervous and call in their loans, or their private banknotes, which would constrict the economy and help fight inflation. But as I've noted in past videos, however, this could lead to a bank panic. In any event, because the value of all specie coins was set at a given ratio to gold, the U.S. was said to be on the gold standard. In the Civil War, the U.S. government needed more money than this system could provide. It didn't have specie gold and silver reserves to simply print more coins. Accordingly, Chase successfully proposed that the government itself print money for the first time, its own paper currency. He also got the U.S. government to, when he did this, off the gold standard, and thus the government could print its new paper currency, its new money, with its value simply, in the faith of the people and its worth. The currency that was he printed was called greenbacks, and it's because it was green on one side. And Chase, by the way, put his picture on the $1 bill, which you can see up here in the top left. Of course, this was the idea of a free-floating currency. It's common today, of course, but not back then. It was new. They were used to a gold standard, and so some people were worried about these new greenbacks ending up worthless. And so initially there was some hoarding of gold. The government tried first to simply stop an independent market in gold, but when it was unable to do so, it allowed the New York Stock Exchange and several others to trade gold directly. Today, of course, the New York Stock Exchange and other markets trade not only in gold, but copper and oil and a whole bunch of commodities. And that just increases the New York Stock Exchange's power. Here, crowds form outside in exchange for gold, worried about its price. To complicate matters further, the federal government had also begun to increase the minting of its silver coins, and this was possible because of a new silver supply found in Nevada in 1859. You can see it here, the arrow pointing these little areas of light blue in the map. It's a famous Comstock lode. If you think of Nevada, I used to have on their license plate Silver State. I don't know if they still do or not. But since the early national era, the Department of Treasury had, minted silver coins and proclaimed a set ratio of the coins in silver to the gold coins. In other words, silver, in a sense, was kind of on the gold standard. Silver coins could be redeemed for a set amount of gold. This hadn't been a problem because the relative supply of silver and gold was even enough, but wanting to inflate its currency and increase the money supply in the Civil War, the Department of Treasury began a massive new coining of silver from this new Comstock lode. And this threatened to undermine the established exchange rate as the value of silver decreased with the new coins. But the Department of Treasury did it anyway to raise money and help fight the war. It would simply agree to address any problems later after the war. It'd deal with that when it came to it. Here's a picture of one of the Nevada boomtowns, Virginia City. And here's one of the silver coins. Actually, this one was, you can see, minted just before the war, but it's a type of coin, silver coins, that they dramatically increased during the war. Now, the government was worried about banks printing too many of their private banknotes. When the government was also printing the greenbacks, it might add to the problem of inflation. And so what they did was they passed a series of national banking acts in 1863, 1864, and 1865. And this is critical. This is important because for the first time, the government was directly regulating the banks, whereas before they'd only been chartered by the states. Now the federal government is going to issue a national charter to banks. And if to get that national charter, the bank had to keep $50,000 on hand in the bank. They couldn't loan it out. And of that 50,000, 30,000 of the value need to be in federal coins or greenbacks or government issued bonds. When few banks agreed to these terms, the federal government got tougher. it began to tax banknotes from unregistered state-chartered banks, and they set the tax at a pretty high 10%. This either drove the banks out of business or into the Federal Registry. By the end of the war, no longer were thousands of banknotes circulating as paper money. Money was either federal coins, greenbacks, or banknotes only by federally chartered banks, only according to these new bank acts. With all of this, the greenbacks, the resulting independent marketing gold, and the banking acts, and it all, the government was able to increase the money supply without letting inflation just get too out of hand in the North. At its worst, inflation was about 75%. Sounds incredibly out of me, but it's reasonably manageable for the crisis war that they were in. The importance of the Civil War for the United States' economy wasn't just in paying for the war or in banking reforms. There are other economic repercussions of the war, and I want to turn to those quickly now. When the South seceded, it obviously took all the pro-slavery element out of Congress. Before the war, worried about slavery, many Southern politicians had fought legislation to encourage a quick settlement and quick development of the West, because they really didn't want, the average Joe and Josephines to go out there. People of moderate to poor means wouldn't be the people to carry slaves out west. So when the South was gone in the war, the new Congress passed several laws to encourage very quick Western development and settlement. And one of the most important was the Homestead Act of 1862. Here you can see a land deed from the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act granted 160 acres for approximately only $1.25 per day. You could get 80 acres for $2.50 if you bought a larger chunk, obviously. If, however, the buyer couldn't show that the land was used as his residence within 5 years, then ownership of the land reverted back to the federal government. Clearly, the law was intended to have land so people wouldn't be speculators. The average Joe could afford it, and they would go out and have to live on it. And so it wouldn't be huge chunks of land bought by rich guys. In the decades that followed, the United States sold, a lot of the majority of its western lands this way. The price varied, but it was still designed to encourage a small middle-class farmer. They still wanted to keep the huge chunks of land out of the hands of the speculators. And if we hadn't done that, who knows what would have happened? They could have bought up the whole West, these speculators, and we'd have almost like a feudal system today. Another bit of legislation that the Congress passed when the South was absent during the war was the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. You may recall from previous videos that there'd been fighting over western railroads because the South wanted it to go southward and the North wanted it to go northward. Well, again, the South's gone, and now the North passes this Pacific Railroad Act. And it allowed the federal government to give cheap, low-interest loans to railroad companies. And with this money, the railroads could then buy western lands and extend the rails westward quickly. It's not a coincidence that the first transcontinental railroad followed just several years later. Lincoln signed this legislation. It's monumental, like the Homestead Act, but people always think of Lincoln as the Civil War, and they don't realize this important domestic legislation he signed as well. The last piece of domestic legislation that was passed by the Northern Congress, I should say the United States Congress in the South was gone, was the Morrill Land-Grant Act. It was named for Vermont Congressman Justin Morrill, and it provided land for a series of colleges in the West. The idea was for these colleges to promote agriculture, engineering, and technology. They wouldn't be true like universities focused solely on academics, which were most states maintained. The assumption was that this would help grow the economy in the West quicker. Here's a picture of an early land-grant college. A lot of, if you look at some of these Western states, they all today have, a university like the University of Texas. And then you've got a land-grant college like Texas Agriculture and Mechanics, aka Texas A&M. You've got the University of Oklahoma, and then you've also got the Oklahoma State University and so forth. Now that I've talked about the economy in the North in the United States, let's turn our attention to the economy in the South, the Confederacy. And you got to start with, again, the reality that in every respect, the South economy was much smaller than the North. Here you can just see an index of, sort of the percentage of the size of the whole economy, the North in the lighter graph and the South in the darker, in almost every category: grain production, exports, population, manufactured goods. The North is greater than the South. First, initially at least, you can say that the war increased industry and finance in the South. Obviously cut off from the northern banks and manufacturing, they had to build their own. A large ironworks, the Tredegar Ironworks, you can see it here, grew up in the Confederate capital of Richmond. By 1863, it employed 2,500 people, and the trouble was there was a lack of pig iron, mainly a product mined in the north, and that hurt. But the Tredegar Ironwork was a major manufacturing operation anywhere. I mean, so it's obviously going to be very critical to the South's efforts throughout the war. Now, any type of stimulative effect of the war on the South didn't last when in the end, when the South started losing. All the expansion of any Southern railroads and any new factories created during the war were all blown up by the Union Army in the end. Southern industry had a lack of labor as well, with all the men in the armed services. So factories relied increasingly on slave labor. And by the way, with all the men fighting, I've already mentioned that women had to assume all the tasks themselves on these farms. All of this didn't help the economy. The South wanted to trade its cotton to Britain's textile factories, but they couldn't because of the Union Naval Blockade I've talked about. Here's a cartoon of the Union Blockade. And I should note that this blockade also kept other supplies from being imported into the South, and that caused severe shortages. It was tough being in the South in the war. There was, for example, a bread riot and so forth. The South, as I mentioned, tried to get the Britain to enter the war and break the blockade, but Britain never did. By the way, Britain, because it wasn't getting sufficient cotton from the American South anymore, began to grow cotton in its new colonies in Egypt and India. In the end, the American merchant marine sort of never recovered. With all the American shipping involved in the war, other nations developed their own commercial shipping and their own markets. Without the larger economy or the developed finance industry like the North, the South had an even more difficult time paying for the war. At the outbreak of the war, the South had only about 12% of the nation's currency and about 21% of the nation's banking assets. So it was difficult for the Confederate government to borrow. It did borrow, but it wasn't able to cover as much of its needs by borrowing as the North. Without as much specie in banks, and I should know, with few banks themselves, the government issued its own bonds, but promised payment in specie only 2 to 3 years after the war had been won, and this hardly instilled confidence in the money, and of course in the bonds. But of course, as the government lost, was becoming apparent that it was losing. Who the heck's going to loan the Confederate government money? It became very difficult for the Confederate government to borrow. Here's a picture of a Confederate bond. The South, of course, raised taxes like the North, but its wealth was concentrated in the agriculture, these plantations, and its economy overall was smaller, so it wasn't able to get as much revenue from taxes as the North. The Confederacy was able to cover only about 6% of its needs from taxation. And here you can see a Confederate tax bill on the left and a tax receipt on the right. Finally, of course, the South just began to print money as fast as they could, regardless of any specie to back it up. And here you can see a Confederate currency. Wasn't worth much at the time, but boy, if you got some today, it's of historic value and worth something. Of course, all this led to Southern, just really horrible inflation in the South. By the end of the war, the money was almost worthless. In the last couple of years, the inflation rate was 700%. I'd said that the North had a relatively manageable 75%, but the South, 700%? Geez. Making matters worse was the terrible counterfeiting of the money. The South didn't have the decent printing presses to make hard-to-counterfeit money, and so a lot of people were faking it. By the end of the war, the Southern economy was nothing more than people hoarding or turning to crime and stealing. And the big thing was bartering, goods for goods, or, relying on black markets with the Northern economy. Many people were near starvation. Its railroads and cities were destroyed, and so rebuilding it all is going to be quite the task. Reconstructing the South would be quite a task, and that's a story, however, for another video. This concludes the video on how the North and South paid for the war and how their economies did during the war.